working a project that I was working on fairly intensely for about 8 months, and then Dustin and I were fortunate enough to have another big project come online. So this has kind of been sitting there and waiting to be finished. But I do think there are some really valuable insights that we've developed from this project, trying to get a better handle of how we can assess water governance to inform policy and practices. There's a ton of water governance assessments out there, but we want to be able to provide timely advice to policymakers, decision makers, to understand, hey, how are you doing, and where are your strengths and weaknesses. So a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to build upon our systematic review to kind of review the different approaches that are being used to measure indicators of adaptive water governance capacity. And then we are trying to synthesize this evidence to inform the development of a rapid, low-cost approach for assessing water governance. And so that is the stage that we are moving to now in this project. And I think I know where it needs to go based upon some of the results of this research. But I'd be really happy to get any feedback, advice, input from the members of this group. So the overview of what I'm going to talk about today, well, and I probably will go through this pretty quickly. Didn't know for sure how many people would be here, but now I know many of you, and I know you already know that environmental crises are governance crises. Primarily, this is a leading driver of our environmental problems that we're facing, and particularly in the water sector. Then go into the methods we used. We used a rapid review of the literature, and I'll let you know a little bit about what that is, and share some of the preliminary results and discuss next steps. So, as we all know, the world is facing a growing number of interconnected environmental crises. So all these things are connected. We have the climate crisis, which obviously affects other problems. It's getting hot. I was hot yesterday out with my kids, just playing outside in May. It was pretty hot, getting sweaty. It's a little early to be getting as sweaty as I was. We have the global biodiversity crisis. As I was talking to Maya before we met, I work with partners at WWF a lot in their conservation work, and they are facing this, this global biodiversity crisis, that the populations that people depend upon are increasing under threat, which creates a lot of challenges. Of course, it's exacerbated by climate change, which affects habitat and so on. And we also have the water crisis. But what differs a little bit about the water crisis is that although there are places where there is water scarcity, and there has been long-term water scarcity, and there are some changes in these places, that increasingly it's social, economic, and governance factors that are affecting people's ability to access safe and affordable water. And that's a big part of Dustin and I's our other project looking at water provisioning in Kenya. I'm not going to talk about that now, but we do know that it is primarily a crisis of governance. And so, yes, although there are many socioeconomic, technological, and natural drivers of environmental crises, so governance is not the only thing driving this, there is a growing consensus that weak governance plays an important role in driving environmental outcomes. That quite simply, we don't have the systems in place to deal with the problems we are facing. And so this has precipitated a few things. It's recognized this is the challenge, but we also, if governance is a problem, or governance is a key part of the problem, we need to have tools or approaches for saying, what aspects of governance affect outcomes. What is the current status of our governance system? What are the strengths and weaknesses? Perhaps we have good rules, but we don't have systems in place in order to implement these rules, to enforce rules, and so on. So a large number of organizations and academics have developed different frameworks or tools for assessing water governance for different purposes. We have analytical frameworks, where analytical frameworks try and measure institutions or governance features and relate them to some outcome, versus evaluative frameworks where they say, this is what good governance is, and the more that you adhere to this principle or to this indicator, the more likely you are to have a successful outcome. And then just on the right there is a quote from the OECD reiterating the point that governance crises are the major drivers of the water problems we're facing. So a little bit of an overview of the approach we took in this project. And the first thing to note is that we conducted a rapid review of the literature on the assessment or evaluation of adaptive water governance capacity. And it's important to note that a rapid review differs from a systematic review in that essentially or a scoping review in that it takes shortcuts. Not necessarily the strongest approach to understand all the evidence that is out there, but it does allow a more quick and a more rapid assessment of the literature. And in practice, many of the scoping reviews or systematic reviews that you will see out there are rapid reviews in practice. They might use different terms, but there are shortcuts. I'm always confused or perplexed when I find studies that somehow magically came up with 50 or 100 studies, a nice round number, to conduct their assessment, because we know in practice that result is quite unlikely. So a rapid review is sometimes more honest assessment or a more honest word language to describe what is actually done. So the search terms that we used are outlined in the table on the left, focusing in on a particular set of populations. So managing at some type of hydrogeographic system, either being a watershed, river basin, drainage basin, or so on. The concepts we were interested were understanding how we measure features of governance. So we talked about indicators, measures, variables, index, framework, and then assessments. And the context is governance or adaptive capacity. And we use these search terms using advanced search functions in Scopus and Web of Science. A few things to note: we excluded the term management from this search because on our initial efforts to develop these search strings, our search returned over 10,000 records. Was just not feasible with the time and resources we had to do a good job of reviewing over 10,000 records. And so we reduced the terms to governance and adaptive capacity. Of course, this imposes some limits, and we also limited it to dates after 2010. So any literature that was published before 2010 is not going to be included in our rapid review. So what did we find? Well, initially we were able to, or what was the process involved in getting down to the studies we reviewed? So somehow this is a very surprising, and I had to double check this when I looked back because it does seem suspicious, but we actually returned 798 records from both Scopus and Web of Science. That really surprised me. And yes, so I did the check multiple times because I was a little worried that I had made a mistake somewhere. But anyway, that each database returned 798 records, and after we eliminated duplicates, we had 1,156 unique articles, to which we added 3 pre-screened records or studies that were particularly prominent, and these are the OECD's governance indicator frameworks. The approaches used by UN Water to monitor SDG 6, the governance components of that, so the Integrated Water Resource Management survey, as well as the Trans-Boundary Water Assessment Program, which assessed governance across several countries. And so we added those to our search. At full text screening, we screened out, we got down to, after abstract screening, we got down to 376 studies by excluding 780. So me and an independent reviewer looked to screen in based on certain criteria. Basically, are they dealing with governance? Do they have some details about indicators and so on? And then we screened all the full text, and we excluded for a variety of different reasons, because we were focused on indicators. And often quantitative indicators. We did exclude papers with no tables or figures. We use that as a tool to enable more rapid screening. Again, that is one of those shortcuts we took as part of a rapid review. We also screened out if there were no governance indicators, if it was not related to fresh water, or if assessments were performed at the individual or household level, because we are interested in governance of at least a community scale, individual or household level assessments of adaptive capacity, for instance, weren't entirely relevant. At the end, this left us with 233 studies, and we randomly selected 47 of the 230 articles left, in addition to the 3 pre-screened articles, in order to have a total sample of 50 reviewed studies. We then developed a data extraction template to extract core details about the studies. And these include basic bibliographic and other details. When was the study published? What locations were they assessing? Not all these studies actually had an implementation component, but the ones that were, we indicated where did they study adaptive water governance capacity, and we measured them along these 14 indicators. And this is something we've struggled with a little bit, is to, so which dimensions should we include? How should we group or lump lump the different dimensions of adaptive water governance? And my big belief is that while there is certain things that should or probably must be included in doing this, there isn't an empirical way that I can say, yeah, this belongs or this doesn't, or this should be grouped or ungrouped. I do think this is really decisions that's based on how intuitive it is to the people that will be using this. As I mentioned, I've worked in consulting for a little bit for the last 4 to 5 years, and I found when I'm working with partners there, sometimes there are trade-offs between the way we as academics should be thinking about assessing, or the way we as academics think about assessing these things. For instance, I use the term decision making down here because I'm hoping that practitioners might draw upon and use this. Whereas if this was more for an purely academic audience, I'd probably use something like collective choice rules and so on. But I think to be used, we need to make things accessible. But I would really love some input here about the dimensions that we are using, because I do think it could use some work, and 14 indicators or 14 dimensions is quite a lot to deal with. The other thing, and the thing that we were most interested in doing, did I skip? My slides got out of order. Okay, something, I will go into the thing that I skipped after, but one of the things we were very interested in doing was identifying those indicators that were both low cost, and at least we perceive them to offer a relatively consistent way for measuring these indicators across different water governance contexts. And so the 2 factors that we looked at were low cost, and this is a subjective assessment of these. We certainly have criteria upon which we made these assessments, but it is subjective at the end of the day. And so indicators were deemed low cost if they required limited investment of time and resources. So these would be things like using secondary data sets if they were available. If you have an Excel sheet online that you can download this data for your indicator assessment, well, that's relatively low cost, as are things like a one-day focus group or an online survey like the Integrated Water Resource Management Survey that's distributed. That's relatively low cost to implement. And I noted some desk-based reviews, and this is where it got a little bit tricky. The desk-based review could be relatively low cost if you were assessing something relatively simple, like whether a river basin has a water basin organization, a river basin organization, or not. That's a relatively simple, low-cost desk-based assessment. In contrast, other documents that would require you to read hundreds of pages of legislation in order to make an assessment, that would not be a low-cost investment. Some of the things that were deemed to be higher cost, basically anything involving field research. If you had to go out to the field, if you had to interview a bunch of different stakeholders Perhaps you use triangulation across multiple sources, which is one of the common approaches that is used. That's not a low cost. You're going to have to spend extensive time in the field to make these assessments. Consistency, meanwhile, was measured based upon, the extent to which there were either well-defined criteria or secondary data sets. So if we could easily measure this across different concepts, that it's unlikely to be interpreted differently across different contexts. And so example of this would be if you ask, is participation effective in this river basin organization? It's very hard to achieve consistency. You and I would probably be thinking about very, very different things when we're trying to measure stakeholder participation versus something like how many stakeholders attended meetings or how many meetings were held for this. That is much easier to measure consistently across cases. It's a well-defined concept. And on that basis, I can make a pretty decent assumption that it is going to be measured consistently across different contexts. So hopefully I'm gonna see if I can find, I'm just gonna jump through and see if I can find a slide that's missing. Okay. I must have accidentally deleted a slide. So we had a slide. The other thing that we coded them on was using logic models. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with logic models, but logic models are tools that are used in policy planning, program design, and so on. They're a practitioner's tool that are frequently used. I worked in government about 5-6 years ago, and it's something that we had to do anytime we wanted to run a program or so on. And it involves the development of a plan. You work backwards you start off with an outcome that you want to achieve, and you work back through outputs, activities, inputs, and then you design the policy in order to achieve that. So it's kind of a logical process for developing policies and programs. And we categorized indicators according to the stage of the logic model that these indicators would be associated with. So this was policy, inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Yes, I'm sorry I deleted that. I must have deleted that only this morning because it was there yesterday. So what are the 50 reviewed studies that we included in our analysis? Well, this isn't entirely surprising. We know about publication trends, that they were concentrated in the global north, with about 25 of the 50 studies focusing in on North America, Europe, while a few of these focused on multiple continents, or lacked an empirical application. Again, not entirely surprisingly, if you look up any search term in Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, you're going to see a chart that looks a lot like this. Of course, we only had 2 years post 2020. I'm sure even by now that might be higher than the 2016 to 2020 range, but publication trends, it's just taking off. And so we did randomly select articles. And so, of course, through random selection, we're likely just to reflect the trends that exist in the literature. So about half of the papers were published in the 5 years between 2016 and 2020. And so the thing we found, or what I think are some of the big findings of our research, were that there were generally 4 high-level models for assessing indicators of adaptive water governance capacity. And I'll go into a little bit of each of these. And I'm just going to see I have some questions here. Okay, I'll answer that more towards the end. And actually, I love the second comment because I think it's going to get into that. So 4 models: subjective assessment by experts, triangulation across multiple sources, coding of policy documents, and integrated monitoring of governance features. And this really gets into that participatory approach because that is exactly what they used in order to develop an integrated monitoring strategy as they worked with stakeholders involved. It isn't necessarily on the basis of what that group deems important, but it certainly was on what they deemed as feasible. And so there might be trade-offs between feasibility and importance, but that is something I think worthy of discussion. I'm happy to discuss as we get to the end. So what do we get to? what type of approach is used in these expert-based assessments? And I think two great examples are the OECD's water governance indicators and UN Water's approach to monitoring SDG 6. And essentially what they do is they ask stakeholders, how are we doing with some guiding questions with respect to different indicators. There's 36 indicators for the OECD and 33 indicators across 12 dimensions for the OECD and 33 indicators for SDG 6. And they differ a little bit. The OECD is designed as a focus group. You organize a meeting, one-day meeting usually. It could go for multiple days, but ideally a one-day meeting. And they come together with some guiding questions and develop these scorecards that can be used for assessing water governance capacity. The UN's a little bit different. It is a survey that's distributed out to a lead agency, who then is supposed to go out and solicit information from related agencies to submit their scores for reporting for the SDG progress and so on. Triangulation across multiple sources, I would say, is probably one of the most common academic method used by academics. And this would involve academics going to one or a relatively small number of cases, no more than 5. I mean, you might increase it slightly. But generally speaking, what they would do is collect as much information as they could about a particular case, usually combining things like document analysis, interviews. Almost always you're going to see these two methods used, document analysis and interviews. Sometimes you get participant observation and surveys. And so the researcher, in this case, would go out, collect this information, review it, and usually they don't have a systematic approach for coding or so on. It's something that's done kind of cognitively. They cognitively process this information, sometimes to develop scores. They'll say presence, absence, high, medium, low, or so on. But sometimes just text descriptions of what's going on that gives a general sense of how governance is doing across a particular dimension. And as I've mentioned before, this triangulation is good. You can do a very good job of measurement within a particular case. You have very strong details behind these measurements, but it can be very costly. And it can also create significant challenges for consistent measurement, because we don't always know or have a sense of how these authors or authors or researchers are coming up with these measurements, and the approaches that I use are very likely to differ substantially from the cases that other people use. But nonetheless, if you are looking for a really detailed understanding of a single case, this is a great way to go. And it's probably why it's used so often. The third approach that is fairly common is the use of coding frameworks and desk-based assessments. So researchers will go out, develop criteria. This is a dimension of good governance, and this is how we are going to measure it. These are the criteria you're going to use to measure it, often based on policy documents and so on. So formal agreements are particularly commonly used in this. And so this is an example from that Anita Millman had for assessing institutional capacity in transboundary river basins. And one of her examples was simply measuring whether a river basin organization exists, to measure whether there was strong authority features within the river basin organization. So generally speaking, these can be low cost because they are desk-based research, and they can be consistent, but this tends to vary with the clarity of the criteria. So here I suggest that and this is the way we coded, is that we deem something to be low cost and consistent if it had relatively clear criteria and you didn't have to go searching through, a 100-page document in order to code one indicator. Presence absence of a river basin organization is something that could be a low cost indicator. Something that would not be consistent and might not be low cost is if you went into meeting minutes to try and get information from these meeting minutes, or watch recordings of public meetings to assess the effectiveness of stakeholder participation mechanisms. This would be very hard to be consistent and could be very time consuming. So again, this of course was done subjectively based upon the interpretation of myself or the other co-author that was assessing these documents. And the last approach that I think offers considerable promise for rapid, low cost, and consistent assessment was drawn from this paper. So this was an N of 1 within our sample. This wasn't a common approach that was used, but nonetheless, it seemed to be promising. And so this was an example from Portugal where they worked with water stakeholders, and these were mostly people working in government, not necessarily farmers or public utilities and so on, where they work together to identify indicators that they could use to assess water governance. And this focused on indicators that were already being collected and retained by relevant agencies. So information about how many meetings we're having, how many fines were issued, how much money did we allocate to different governance functions like monitoring, enforcement, and so on. And so this appeared to me at least to offer a relatively promising approach for governance assessment. So now I'm going to kind of briefly conclude with some of the numbers or the distribution of the indicators that we found in the study, put some numbers on some of the trends that we found. And so this is not, although this is a random sample, this isn't a complete picture of how people are doing governance assessments because we took a rapid review. And so a small number of papers can have a bigger influence on the results. And so we had one paper that had a bunch of indicators on stakeholder participation, but nonetheless, stakeholder participation was particularly common across the cases as a key feature that people are emphasizing as a feature of good water governance. In comparison, there was comparatively less attention to questions of enforcement and conflict resolution. People are interested in how we're making decisions about water governance, how we develop and share information among stakeholders, as well as the instruments that we're using, while the rest of the indicators seem to be around, the 20 to 30 range. What we deem to be low cost and consistent indicators appear to be relatively rare, that only about 15% of all the indicators we coded, and those were about, I should have mentioned that we did have about 500 indicators, but we only had enough information to assess whether they were low cost and consistent for about 400 of these, and about 15% were low cost and consistent. And low cost and consistent indicators were more common for enforcement and relatively rare for features such as horizontal integration, transparency, and decision making. And some of the reasons for this are probably not entirely surprising. We're thinking about horizontal integration. Do we have connections across these? Are we establishing policies to coordinate governance across different sectors? That either can be high cost, because we know there's a lot of sectors interested and involved in water. So that can be particularly hard to achieve. You need to either read a bunch of documents or you're likely to miss something in that. And it can be challenges in consistency, and that the types of sectors that are relevant may vary across different contexts and so on. So it's harder to develop a consistent indicator. And so they often rely upon subjective perceptions, is how well are policies integrated across different sectors. And yes, I wish I had my slide on the logic model, but most indicators are assessed based upon the outcomes they generate. So basically, people go out and they assign some goal for a particular dimension, stakeholder participation. We want people to be happy with the process, to accept the rules are developed, and the questions that we'll ask are these stakeholder participations, is stakeholder participation relatively effective? And so most of our indicators are focusing in on that question, while less than 15% of indicators are focused on other stages of the policy or of the logic model. So the policy content, inputs, outputs, or activities. Sorry, less than 15% are inputs, outputs, or activities. But we did find some differences across these categories in terms of where we found the low cost and consistent indicators. Very rarely did we find low cost, consistent indicators for outcomes. These are often, again, just asking people their subjective perceptions. Is stakeholder participation effective? Is enforcement effective? Is our monitoring system adequate? And so on. Very hard to achieve a consistent measure of these concepts, whereas it appeared to be more concentrated, better chances of doing this if you're focusing on policy content. Do we have a river basin organization input? How much resources did we allocate for certain governance functions, as well as outputs? Is, how many meetings did we hold? How many people attended these meetings, and so on? It was much easier to develop a low-cost, consistent indicator. So what are the next steps in this project? So we have a few things to do. We want to update our coding framework. And so these are just making small changes, different lumpings and groupings of dimensions. As I mentioned, 14 categories is a little bit unwieldy for coding. And so we also wanted to include all stages of the logic model. So you'll see here, there are 5 stages in our updated logic model. We'd initially grouped activities and outputs as a singular category, and we want to go back to ungroup these to separately distinguish between activities. So these are things like meetings organized by governments, whereas outputs are things like, the percentage of actors that attended these meetings. So that's one change we want to make. We want to go back to update the results. And finally, develop recommendation and tools for rapid, low-cost, and consistent assessment of adaptive water governance capacity. And we do think that this is going to focus more on developing tools for measuring policy content, inputs, activities, and outputs as a way to complement other approaches. And so that's one of the things I want to highlight, is that we're not suggesting that focusing on simply these dimensions, content, inputs, outputs, and activities, should be the only way that water governance assessments are done, but rather that there is a gap there, that we have lots of people doing a very detailed job using triangulation to assess adaptive water governance capacity in single cases, and we need these. They add a lot of depth, and they are very useful within a particular case. At the same time, we do need what the OECD and UN Water Agency are doing in performing expert-based assessments, that there's real use for those. They provide an opportunity for reflection, for groups to come together to develop a consensus of how they're doing, and also an opportunity for them to plan. But within this, there's also room for these relatively rapid, low-cost assessment techniques that could be done on an annual basis in a lot of places by integrating monitoring of governance features with day-to-day activities, so that they can do this, on an annual basis. They can develop an annual report to understand where they're doing, how this is changing year over year, and so on. And so that's where I think this is leading. So I'll stop there, and happy to discuss, get your advice, feedback, and yeah,